Okay, rotator cuff tears, recognition, repair, and rehab. I went with the 3 R's so it would be easier to remember, just like those 5 P's for audits and presentations, as you all frantically try and remember any of the 5 P's. Apologies off the bat, I obviously don't have the silky voice of a Jen Nelson, the IT skills of Andrew, and certainly not the special effects abilities of George Lucas or indeed our own Shauna. So you'll have to bear with me. Bit of background on the in-service. There was a couple of articles or a couple of video presentations online that were recommended by Kate, given by Joe Gibson. And in it kind of referenced the intimate relationship between the cuff and the capsule. Not something I'd really spent a lot of time thinking. For me, they were always kind of two separate issues. So one article led to another, led to an online course, etc. So the sources and the references in it are varied and come from a variety of places. So I've tried to make it simple and just reference them as we go. If there are ones that you want specifically, then certainly get in touch with me and I can give you the source specifically. So regarding cuff pain and shoulder pathology, it is one of the most common causes of pain, and it's seen in about 30% of the general population. Regarding rotator cuff tears specifically, there is that kind of contrast between symptomatic and asymptomatic, and we'll talk about that as we go. Warland in 2003 noted that 40% of over 50s had asymptomatic cuff tear, so we'll kind of talk about that in a bit. Now, so the idea and the kind of in-service objectives: review the basic cuff and advanced capsular anatomy, knowledge of causes, risk factors, increase awareness of the classification systems that are out there, discuss the role of imaging, basically X-rays versus MRI, identify possible cuff tears using appropriate tests, have an advanced understanding regarding surgical considerations in relation to the latest research findings, and kind of dovetailing with that is being aware of the current treatment options and how they relate to different client cohorts. So which clients will benefit from certain surgeries, and if indeed they need that benefit from it at all. So at the sort of basic cuff anatomy, now these are basic illustrations. What I like about them is, though, in these images down here, the main arrow or the main line that comes from the muscle is the main force vector or pull of the muscle. And what we can see, if we look even at the anatomy of the deltoid when the arm is at the side, is that the middle fibers are almost entirely vertical, meaning that their line of force is straight up. So in the absence of some kind of mechanical change, that's the movement that the humeral head is going to go into. What we can see, particularly infraspinatus, slightly downward vector, but certainly the teres minor has a significant downward vector. And then furthermore, when we have a look from the anterior perspective, that the subscapularis also has a significant downward vector. So 3 of the 4 muscles, subscapularis, teres minor, and infraspinatus, all have a force vector which is resisting or counteracting that anterior translation of the humeral head during abduction. Of note, and this may help to kind of explain why there are so many people out there that are coping or are asymptomatic with cuff tears. Now, to go on now to the kind of the microscopic capsular anatomy, and this is kind of the thing that kind of tweaked my interest early doors with the Joe Gibson webinar. What it spoke of was the intimate relationship, and I think this kind of illustrates on a cellular level that this being the humeral head here, and what we have going from medial to lateral is the cuff and capsule and the transition between the two. So the box illustrated here, B, is magnified here, and what we see is definite capsule on the bottom, and then there's a margin between the two, certainly that differentiates them, and then we have muscle tissue above, when we go more medially or more laterally, sorry, in the box A, which is down here, what we see is that there's very little differentiation between the two, and this actually decreases as you go further laterally. So they're almost the same and indistinguishable as we go laterally. Difficult to get an idea from that image what we're looking at when we talk about it in real terms, but this is an actual sort of humeral head. This would be a bird's eye view from superior of the right shoulder. So we are anterior here, posterior here, medial, and then we're lateral out here. And what we can see when it talks about the firm and sort of loose attachment area is the actual relationship between the cuff and the capsule, as opposed to the capsule and the humeral head, or the cuff and capsule itself, so, or cuff and humeral head. So what we can see is from the images here is that from almost halfway out, so from halfway to point of insertion, the capsule and the cuff are almost one. They are almost intimately related the whole way. What that means functionally is that if we see a lesion in one, i.e. the cuff, it's obviously going to have a detrimental, if not catastrophic, impact on the capsule that is part of it also. So epidemiology, etiology, degenerative changes, repetitive microtraumas. This could be from work, sport, severe traumatic injuries. The fall on the outstretched shoulder would be the main. Atraumatic injury could just be, gardening, anything. And there's an example I'll talk about later. Secondary dysfunctions can be either issues with the shape of the shoulder or the acromion, or even things like thyroid dysfunction. So extrinsic factors: subacromial internal impingement, tensile overload, repetitive stress, intrinsic poor vascularity, alterations in material properties, matrix, and composition. And with many of these things, aging is a factor which is beginning to concern me slightly more in recent years than it used to. One other aspect that is of note, and when you can benefit from it on an X-ray, I suppose you can get some information certainly on an MRI, is a thing called the critical shoulder angle. Now, this was a new sort of concept to me. It's a line which is drawn along the margin of the glenoid and then to the tip of the acromion. The idea being that the larger the angle, the more at risk people are for cuff dysfunction. Again, this would be a smaller one. The idea being that the larger the angle, it means that the lever arm and the work that the supraspinatus would have to do is increased. Therefore, increased workload, increased likelihood that it will fail ultimately. So this is sort of a classification system of partial tears. Not really going to talk about partial tears too much. The majority we'll be talking about is as actual full thickness and massive tears. So basically, you're going to talk about the thickness is measured in sort of millimeters, and then reference is made to whether it's on the articular surface, sort of below, or if it's superior on the bursal side. So the bursal surface, or as they've described here, the Brussels surface, which I'm assuming was a typo. Classification systems that we commonly see. This one was by Colin. It's a more recent one in 2015. Now, it's not one that I've ever seen sort of described with either referrals or anywhere else in the literature, in truth. In this, he uses, each one of the muscles is given a marker, and then the subscapularis is given a double to indicate whether it's partially torn or completely torn. So, for example, here we have supraspinatus and subscapularis with a partial tear, and here we have supraspinatus and subscapularis with a full tear. And then the variety of different combinations give you the different types. But again, not one I've seen, but it was referenced in one of the online courses. The more common one from Cofield in 1982 is one that is often referenced, and certainly the small, medium, large on referrals from both consultants would be fairly common. Sometimes they will further differentiate between if there's a specific tear, and we'll have a look at that in a second. And what we have here is the large, small, medium, large, and then the massive. And the massive often is one that is actually retracted beyond the margin of the glenoid as well. So again, types of full thickness tears, rarely would it be reported. Normally they stop at kind of full thickness, but we have crescent, reverse L, L-shaped, trapezoidal, and massive. Now with the reverse L and the L, there's just better images here. So these are better images of the reverse L and L, and these are regularly reported, where the consultant may say, medium tear or full thickness tear of the supraspinatus, associated with an L shape. So these are of note and reported. So the characteristics and clinical presentation, just obviously this list is not exhaustive or definitive. For example, severe pain at the time of injury may or may not be the case. Pain at night, is quite common but can vary. Pain with overhead activities, painful arc sign, weakness of the involved muscle or muscles depending on how many are involved in the tear, and shoulder stiffness. Differential diagnosis, how long is a piece of string? There's all kinds of things that could be causing the issue. These are just the ones that are kind of listed. I'm not going to read all the way through them. So diagnostic procedures and our kind of subjective history. So it's important to find out what happened, how did it affect you, and we'll talk about the importance of that kind of question as we talk about the clinical implications. Night pain, weakness, what do you do? So again, how is it affecting the client, and what are they working at? Is it a labor intensive? Is it a desk job? Beware of yellow flags. They were listing sort of depression, workers' compensation, etc., etc. Clinical examination, imaging either by X-ray or gold standard would be the MRI, and the IMPT is the isometric muscle performance test, the likes of a Biodex, which wouldn't really be routinely done, and we certainly don't have access to machines of that nature. When we look at examination, generally speaking, examination, if the test is either painful or the client is not able to achieve the test position, it's considered positive. These are the kind of the more common tests that are out there. In my experience, it's more almost, physio preference, which ones you like to do, which ones you've got more confidence in. But these have a variety of sensitivities and specificities, and not all that great in many instances. When we look at sort of a clinical predictive rule, and this is based on the Park et al. In 2005, if the client has a positive drop arm sign, positive painful arc, and infraspinatus muscle test weakness or pain with that test, there's a 91% chance that they have a full thickness tear. From my own perspective, my own predictive rule is if it looks like a duck and it quacks, then it's probably a duck. So these would just help to confirm. So diagnostic procedure, X-ray or MRI. Well, I think sometimes the benefit of an X-ray can be overlooked, but there are some things that we can gain from it. On the image on the left here, what we see is that the superior translation, the superior positioning of the humeral head. Now, not always the case. What also we can gain from an X-ray is whether there's a significant joint arthrosis, if there's significant arthritis, and if there's a bone spur, or also we'll get an idea of the shape of the acromion. So when we look at this image, if this was a simple X-ray and was reported, it would be indicative of a massive rotator cuff tear, where the cuff has actually retracted beyond the glenoid, which has given it room then for the humeral head to translate superiorly. On ultrasonography, what we have is the bald head sign. In other words, the humeral head has no tissue above it. And then on MRI, what we see is this white surface, or the white would indicate kind of a fluid-filled gap, where the cuff is completely retracted, enabling the humeral head to translate superiorly. Again, MRI. In this instance, we have a normal X-ray on the right. What we have here is a gap between the humeral head, which is well positioned in the glenoid, and the gap, if it's normally around 6 mil, it's indicative that the cuff has not retracted. So it doesn't mean there isn't a tear, because as we can see here, that we have what's probably a small to medium sized tear. But given that the cuff, the muscle hasn't retracted fully, we still have that intact gap between the humeral head and acromion. So it is worth getting an X-ray, at least initially, because it may help from a treatment perspective. So a big tear, do we have big problems? Well, not necessarily. This is a client of mine. He was 83 years of age and an avid gardener. He gardens 6 days a week. He has 4 gardens, his own, and his 3 kids. I offered him a 5th one, but he declined the offer. This gentleman is an example of what's most likely was an acute on chronic tear. He was gardening on a Friday or Saturday, felt something in his shoulder, nothing too crazy. No major issue that night. The next day it was painful, struggled to sleep the following night. Attended his GP, was given a course of anti-inflammatories, and then he was told to go to physio after the anti-inflammatories were finished. Now, given he had 2 weeks holidays from the week after the doctor, he came to me about 3.5 weeks post lesion or that initial incident, at which time he reported that it had settled down significantly. He wasn't having pain at night, and the swimming while he was on holidays seemed to help loosen it up significantly. Now, there was a little bit of weakness there, and he did quite well. But you can see there, he's a complete full thickness tear of the lateral supraspinatus, medial tendon retraction, significant near complete tear of the infraspinatus. So it's marked rotator cuff and muscle and deltoid atrophy. So this doesn't look good, but he actually did quite well. Now he ended up, from a gardening perspective, that he had to limit overhead activities because they were aggravating him. So he went out and bought 2 little sets of little step ladders that he was able to use to keep everything at either shoulder or below shoulder level. So this, gentleman may have looked as if he was going to be a surgical candidate, but did quite well with conservative rehab. And we look at our questions. So if I have a tear and don't have surgery, will it get worse, become irreparable? Well, you have a 1 in 4 or a 1 in 2 chance that yes, it will progress and this will be associated with pain. Will I lose function in the future? Not really clear from the literature. Will surgery improve things? Well, Moosemeyer certainly at 5 and 10 years said there was a significant difference in favor of surgery versus physio only. And is surgery always a success? Well, no, up to a third or possibly more will have a failure, structural failure. However, that's still associated with better outcome. So if we go back down now, and if we look, so 2 things of the studies with rotator cuff were of kind of interest. One, when you talk about long-term longitudinal studies for surgical issues, the surgeries can change over time. So when you're analysing what was done 10 years ago, it may not even be best practice now. Surgical techniques could have been refined, but so could the rehab have been refined. So it's difficult to correlate directly. You can just kind of extrapolate as best you can. Also in the literature, most of the surgical studies used what was called a constant score or constant Murley score. The significance of that is that within the constant Murley, it's marked out of 100. But what we see here is that pain is actually only marked out of 15. So it represents 15% of a small proportion of the overall. The majority, or 65%, is given 25% to power and 40% is given to range. So within that kind of surgical studies, there's an awful lot of emphasis given to movement and power and very little to pain, and this can kind of skew things a little bit. So with that in mind, if we look at the actual outcomes from tendon repair versus physiotherapy only, and this is the Moose-Meyer 10-year follow-up, when we look at it from a pain perspective, a strength perspective, and then the overall constant score, what we see is that from a pain perspective, the repair was less than 1 on the repair group was less than 1 out of 10, but that physio only group at 10 years, the pain level was still well under, just over 2 and well under 3. And if we look at the other study, the Russell et al. Study, what they found was after rotator cuff repair that if the repair failed, it was still under 2, but the acceptable level of pain reported in the literature for sort of shoulder pain is 3 out of 10. So if you're below 3 out of 10, that's considered an acceptable level. So both the physio only and the repair group, and the difference between these was not considered significant at 10 years, both below 3, so an acceptable pain level. When we look at strength, this was the only variable that had individually significant difference. And what we see is a difference of about 2 kilos or 5 pounds. Now it's 10 kilos to 12, so I think that's significant as well. And that corresponds well with the repair versus failed repair, where they noted that there was about a 5 pound difference in function between the two. So it does seem as if repair, lends itself to increased strength, but not necessarily overall function. The post hoc analysis has 3 groups because they split people who went from the physio only group into the surgery group ultimately. But what we see is that anything over 80 is considered very, very satisfactory, or high, it's considered good to excellent. Anything over 70 is actually considered adequate or satisfactory. And what we can see is the 3 groups all were over 70. So when you look at it from this perspective, the 10-year follow-up, the only significant difference was strength. Between the repair and unrepaired group, both groups were underneath that 3 out of 10, which is the acceptable level, and both the repair and non-repair group had constant scores which were above 70. So I think this is clinically more significant for us when we're looking at decision making regarding clients that are asking for advice about whether or not they should have surgery or not. So again, what's the patient's primary concern? Is the patient having pain, or is it concerned with weakness or functional loss? I think if it's a younger client that has weakness, then certainly repair may be indicated. But if it's an older client where they're having pain and we anticipate that pain may dissipate over time, then possibly there's a role for surveillance MRIs where people are re-examined maybe a year or 18 months down the road to see if that tear is progressing, because one of the, I have the reference somewhere, but I can't think of it to hand now. One of the studies actually mentioned a point of no return where the muscle fatty infiltration within the muscle and muscle atrophy leads to a point of no return where, even if it's repaired, that muscle, may not get back functionally because of either those morphological changes are irreversible at that time, and possibly damage has been done to the suprascapular muscle if we're talking about the supra spinatus. So if we're talking about repairs, what we have is our basic repair of a full thickness cuff. So there's a couple of things that can be done. Either the 2 ends of the tendon, depending on what the tear is like, are either just sutured directly, or sometimes it involves anchors, depending on if it's an insertional, the tear is that close to the bone in essence, that anchors are required to facilitate the repair. Repairs are normally either single or double row. The single row is the approximation of the repair itself, but then the double row adds an element of compression. Again, it's down to surgical choice. There was no kind of research that I could find on this, although anecdotally the surgeons and those doing the double row felt that that compression element added to initial repair strength and repair over time. Also can be involved is the either a tenotomy or tenodesis of the long head of the bicep tendon. Oftentimes this tendon can be a source of pain as it's been significantly irritated if, over time, and again, a chronic tear where the humeral head has been constantly being pulled superiorly, that tendon will be compressed, which can lead to irritation and degeneration of it itself. So either the tendon is just basically cut, retracted, or it can be reattached on just at the bicipital groove, which helps to facilitate keeping the normal shape of the muscle. You can get that kind of, it's just simply the tenotomy, you can end up with that kind of Popeye appearance in the bicep. I've included a couple of typical programs here. Now I have typical in inverted commas because these are never sort of that linear. It will vary from surgeon to surgeon. It will vary from between the type of tear, small, medium, to large. It can vary on how long the client has been suffering with these symptoms. But basically, you're looking at about a 6-week period of time that your arm is going to be in a sling and slight abduction. The idea being no active movement to give the repair a chance to heal when it's at its most vulnerable. The difference between the two of these is that Hawkins is an orthopedic surgeon and Simmons is a doctor of physio, so a DPT. So what you have is Simmons has included prehab, which I think, as long as it's not causing significant aggravation or pain, is massively important. The different phases just bring the client through different strengthening, and then phase 4 in the kind of the Hawkins one, or stage 5 in the Simmons, is where the difference really is, depending on what your client is hoping to get back to, whether it's gardening, golfing, or laying bricks. It's definitely that element where you're going to kind of change it significantly. But in the early days, it really is fairly straightforward and very basic for all clients. So options for clients that have had a massive rotator cuff tear. So massive rotator cuff tears, if there's not a good outcome if they're repaired directly, the partial repair in association with a capsule or a different combination is the way to go. So what we have is options. So one of the options is a superior capsule reconstruction. And what you have here, and again, this is for a younger active patient with good rotation strength but weak arm elevation. So what you have here is an allograft or autograft of what was more commonly used was the IT band, where it's attached directly to the humerus and the glenoid rim, and then it is stitched in with the remaining cuff. Now, in a clinical commentary on this, Carrigas, who's actually referenced there, said he was a very much a naysayer originally, and that he considered that this was just sort of interpositional soft tissue therapy, where over time the humeral head would continue to rise superiorly, and it would just be almost like a mortar and pestle, that over time this would degrade significantly, rendering it useless. However, he is converted. It does seem that in cadaveric studies, and also in a study by Mihata in 2016, where the cadaveric study showed that the biomechanics of the shoulder were actually changed with this superior capsule repair. And at 5 years, Mihata found 27 of 30 showed they were still structurally intact. So this reverse trampoline or inverted trampoline effect, where the superior capsule repair provides an elastic resistance to that superior translation. So it does seem to work. And if we look at the image here, we have, this is the cuff pre, and then we have this post. Now, I'm not certain that this is the greatest image because this shows very little distance between the humeral head and the acromion. However, it was reported as a positive outcome, but certainly one to consider in possibly younger clients. Again, the in-space, which is the kind of the brand name balloon procedure, acts as a depressor. It's less invasive. The balloon is simply inserted and then inflated. This is truly just an space occupying balloon. It's more indications for pain relief and for older clients that have medical comorbidities or lower functional demands. The limitations are it doesn't really impact function and strength. And it is biodegradable, so it degrades over time, but there was no indication of how long that takes, and there's limited clinical sort of long-term data as to its efficiency. So tendon transfers, these are for more kind of higher functional demand patients with work-related weakness. There has been work done with the PEC major with very limited success. There is more recent studies which show good success with the middle trap, but no long-term outcome. But the more usual one is the transfer of the latissimus dorsi to give more sort of structural control. The limitations of this is that sometimes clients struggle with the muscle control because you're taking what is in essence an internal rotator and powerful adductor, and you're giving it an external rotation and element to it. So retraining and relearning that can be a challenge to some clients. The reverse shoulder arthroplasty is the most invasive. It's, you know, like all great ideas, it's brilliant in its simplicity. To reverse the geometry of the shoulder means that the rotational element is brought more laterally. This, in combination with the reversal in the geometry, means that the deltoid has a much better mechanical advantage as far as causing or creating abduction. It is indicated for more clients with rotator cuff arthroplasty or significant joint arthrosis. I've actually had great outcomes with these. Very rarely have I not had sort of a successful outcome. Varying degrees of range, but almost every one of the clients, I've probably seen 10 or 15 at this stage, and every one of them was really, bar one I should say, was happy with the outcome, and the one that wasn't happy had probably the best range and was completely pain-free. So there's no pleasing everyone. Success rates are about between 70 and 80% is what the literature would kind of say. So here's just a synopsis of the decision-making guide for massive tears. And again, the massive tears, you know, it's very different to the small, medium and large. We talk about here, we have that latissimus dorsi or trapezius tendon transfer. Intermediate, we have the deltoid rehab. For the elderly over 70, we have the deltoid rehab, reverse arthroplasty. So this is kind of a basic table of where you're at in terms of what the options are for clients at various stages. For the older clients with the where we have deltoid rehab, if they're not surgical candidates and they're not candidates for any of the other, these are the clients that may be of benefit or may benefit from the sort of Torby program. Now, to kind of revisit the biomechanics, the idea behind the Torby program, and it was a lot of work done by, I think it's Ainsworth, I think it was Rebecca Ainsworth. But the idea is that they noticed people with rotator cuff tears that some were coping and others were not. So anecdotally, when they looked at it, they thought that the ones that were coping had a more, they were using their anterior deltoid more, and that they had greater external rotation strength. So given that if we look at the teres minor has a significant downward kind of vector element to it, that may explain why, in combination with the anterior delt was providing the elevation, and then the downward force of the humeral head was being provided by the teres minor. So what they decided to do was, given that that was what they had kind of looked at anecdotally, was to actually put together a program which focused on both of these elements to see if they could improve people who previously were not using these strategies, and would it make any difference. So there was 10 patients initially. It was a 12-week program. The average age of the clients, I think, was about 75 and a half was the average age, and it was over a 12-week program. And what they found was that there was a significant difference in both pain and function over that time. So if we look at examples of this, and this kind of brings it back to the Joe Gibson, because with the sort of co-contraction and proprioceptive element that she was talking about, but that was more to do with the frozen shoulder. So what we have here is area anterior deltoid. So it's a short lever. Clients are instructed, to, if they are forward flexing, to try and do it with an elbow bent to decrease the lever arm as in a functional capacity. But for here, you start off with a small lever, small range, and as control and strength improves, then we go to greater range and the longer lever, and then ultimately, greater range. The external strength is also important, and that's strengthened in isolation. This is actually just an example of an exercise where you're dealing with proprioception and a co-contraction. So as you're forward flexing, you're also getting that external rotation aspect with the resistance of the TheraBand. So the muscle, in essence, and that co-contraction, as that anterior deltoid fires, you're trying to encourage the external rotation to fire with it to get some functional gains. So the proposed pathway is, as such. So possibly GP-led advice, medication, physio advice. If we're not seeing the success, or the client's not happy with their pain levels or functional levels, that might be followed up with an injection plus or minus a scan, and ultimately surgery, and then back to physio for their rehabilitation. That covers pretty much all of it. If there are any questions, or anyone has any specifics that they want to ask me about, or any of the resources or references that I've mentioned, there was a couple that I kind of mentioned that aren't on it, just drop me an email and I will send them on to you. So anyone, any questions, they can just drop me an email. If I can answer them, I'll get back, and if I can't, I'll try and find somewhere or someone who can. So I hope you enjoyed the 38 and a half minutes with the option of muting me or pausing me at any time, which is always a benefit. So hopefully I'll see you all soon.